Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and today is actually May 19th as I'm shooting this, but I'm sure by the time you see this, it's going to be somewhere deep into summer, which means we're coming up on football season. I want to talk about college football. Now, it's 1998. It's my first summer living in Oregon. And having grown up in California, a big sports fan, but I didn't really pay too much attention to college football in Oregon. College football in Oregon is huge. Big rivalry between Oregon and Oregon State. I sort of knew about it, but I didn't pay any attention to it. And it's our first year there. It's our first, what is called Civil War. That's the big game between Oregon and Oregon State. And we were at a church function. It was a big dinner, lots of people there. And it seemed like half the room was cheering for the Ducks, and the other half was cheering for the Beavers. And they had a TV in the other room, and people kept kind of finding an excuse to run in there and find out what was going on in the game. It was one of these games that was back and forth, back and forth. One team would score, then the other team would score. So there was lots and lots of good-natured trash talking going on. And at that point, that's when I asked what I thought was an innocent question. I said, now, Oregon State, that's the Ducks, right? The whole room got quiet. It was like when a gunfighter walks into the saloon and the piano player stops playing. Everybody turned and looked at me. And somebody said, no, Oregon State is the Beavers. University of Oregon is the Ducks. And I realized at that point, I did what seemed to be impossible. I managed to unite this entirely divided room. They all now had a common cause of being annoyed with me. That's actually one of the fun things about sports is talking trash to opponents, people who like a different team than you. That's always good natured until it isn't. I will tell you though, in my line of thinking, there is nothing more arrogant to me than a Denver Broncos fan, unless it's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. You see, that's human nature. We like to see, though, the arrogant get their comeuppance. This is what Hollywood is based on. In movies, you always see the arrogant bad guy get his comeuppance. In today's passage, Paul warns the Gentiles who are in God's inner circle now. They weren't before. Before, they were not part of God's people. Now they are. And now it seems like the Jews are outside the circle. And Paul says, well, hang on. No trash talking. No being arrogant to them. Okay, but let me ask a question. I'm actually very serious about it. Why not? In the past, the Jews had been so arrogant and condescending to the Gentiles. So why is it now, when the tables are turned, that Paul expects the Gentiles to be gracious? Why was Paul going out of his way to tell Gentiles not to be arrogant? It almost seems like they had earned the right to be after everything that they had been through. Where things stood now, Gentiles were coming to Jesus and they were right with God because they believed in the gospel. They had accepted the Son of God as their Savior. And the Jews, who had been in the inner circle, had been the chosen people, a lot of them are now on the outside looking in because they had rejected the Savior. The tables were turned, but Paul is not interested in anybody gloating or anybody being arrogant on the part of the Gentiles. Look at verses 16 through 18. Yes, I realize we are skipping down in the chapter, but we'll get back to it. Verse 16. If the part of the dough offered, hang on just a second here. Okay, my phone. If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. He says that the Gentiles, you're like wild olive branches, and you were grafted into a cultivated olive tree. All through the Old Testament, the olive tree was used as a symbol for Israel. People would have understood, especially the Jews, would have understood exactly what Paul was saying here. He's talking about God's chosen people. And now some of these natural branches have been broken off, and these wild branches have been grafted in. Paul was saying that God has taken the tree of Israel, he's broken off some of those true branches, the Jews, and he's put Gentiles in. Okay, but now let's look at these next few verses in 19. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief. And you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. All right, that's pretty plain right there. Now, with the Gentiles in and the Jews out, it seems that there's a growing sense of arrogance among the Gentiles. Remember, the Jews have thought of themselves as the chosen people, and they've been so dismissive of the Gentiles. And now, when the tables are turned, Paul tells the Gentiles, don't be arrogant toward the Jews. Again, how come? Hey, haven't we earned this privilege? It's our bragging rights now. We're the people of God. Why can't we do a little boasting? Well, then to top it off, Paul is kind of saying, the tables could be turned back the other way. Be careful. Look verses 21 through 24. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? What Paul does now is he points out, hey, you know what? Yeah, God saved you Gentiles when you were pagans. And if God's going to do that, how much more willing will he be to save his chosen people if they come back to him? God absolutely will take the Jews back if they decide, yes, we do want to follow Jesus. Okay, but that's the thing. At this point, the Jews were not coming back. They weren't about to come to Jesus, because to do that now would mean that they would have to associate with these horrid Gentiles, and they are not going to do that. Jews aren't going to stoop to a fellowship with Gentiles. And these are the people that Paul is saying not to be arrogant towards. Really? The people who had rejected the Gentiles, now that the Gentiles are following Jesus, they don't want anything to do with Jesus either. They had been following Jesus. Now you Gentiles show up. No, we don't want him. Don't be arrogant to those people. If your wife comes to you and says, hey, listen, my old boyfriend, the guy I was dating before I married you, well, I just found out he's never really liked you. And he dumped me, by the way, but he doesn't really like you, and he wants nothing to do with you. So I was thinking maybe you should try being a little nicer to him. No. How is this situation different? Maybe Paul should be worrying about improving the attitude of these Jews and not worry so much about, hey, Gentiles, be nice to these guys who have never been nice to you. All right, what was Paul really saying here? Well, to find out, tune in next time. Till then, have a great day.